Now it's my great pleasure to introduce to you the Secretary-General of Amnesty International, Salil Shetty. Salil Shetty became Amnesty's 8th Secretary-General in July 2010. As leader of the organisation, he's of course responsible for developing and coordinating Amnesty's strategies to promote and protect human rights and is the organisation's chief spokesperson. Previously, he was director of the United Nations Millennium Campaign, where he played a pivotal role in building the global advocacy campaign for the achievement of the Millennium Development Goals. He was instrumental in the formation of the global call to action against poverty and in leading the Stand Up Against Poverty initiative in 2009, which mobilised over 173 million people across the world. That's what we like to hear. Prior to joining the UN, he led the transformation of ActionAid into a leading global campaigning and advocacy NGO. Salil Shetty became first involved in campaigning for human rights when growing up in an activist home in Bangalore, India. Please welcome him to Brisbane. Salil Shetty.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you all for joining us. It's great to be in Brisbane. I want to, of course, start by acknowledging the traditional owners, the Yagera and the Turrbal peoples, and thank them for their continued custodianship of this land. This land always was and always will be their land. So a special thanks to Les and Mary and Marushi and others who, so many of you, I'm not naming each of you here. It's very difficult to follow two Aboriginal people, I think, on this platform. They're always the best, most articulate speakers and singers. But it's great to be here today. Wonderful to be part of this conference. And thanks to Amnesty International Australia for organizing this event. So what does the 21st century hold? That's what I've been asked to speak about. Well, first things first, I guess we should probably show a bit of humility here and in some respects declare that we don't really know what the future holds. That may be alarming, but I think it's also exciting. The lesson of the past few years and of the human rights revolutions that we have seen across the past year is very clear. We must always expect the unexpected. And that means something of enormous importance for human rights activities. Activists. We must believe that change is achievable. The East European revolutions of 1989 and the human rights revolutions that swept across the Middle East and North Africa in the last 12 months are different in many ways, but they do have two obvious shared features. First, the huge courage shown by the protesters who risked their lives in Berlin, Prague, and Bucharest to bring down tyrants, just as they did in Tunis and Cairo and Tripoli and elsewhere in the region. And the second thing both these revolutions have in common is this: few governments saw those protests coming. On the contrary, politicians insisted that such changes were unthinkable, or worried aloud about what such change might bring for loss of stability. In fact, I remember my colleague who's a director of Amnesty International in the United States, Larry Cox, he told us that he was at a meeting in December of 2010 when the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton specifically said that if there's one place where no change is going to happen, it is Egypt. 25 days later, Mubarak was gone, of course. And that is the country with the largest intelligence network in the world. So the politicians were too locked into their belief in the status quo. They believed that because things have always been like this, this is also how things will be for all eternity. And as we know, they were wrong. Amnesty International, which is, as Claire mentioned, celebrating its 50th anniversary this year, is another example of defying conventional wisdoms. One typical critic in 1961, which is when Amnesty was formed, he no doubt thought of himself as a pragmatist, cleverer than those foolish optimists, declared that Peter Benenson's idea of people all over the world coming together to create change was, for him, within quotes, one of the larger lunacies of our time. Well, we can see from the perspective of today, over 3 million members and supporters make up Amnesty International all over the world, and this number is growing. We can see how wrong he was. Amnesty International has had astonishing impact over the decades since that first crucial moment when Peter Benenson read a story in the newspaper about 2 Portuguese students jailed for toasting freedom during the Salazar dictatorship, and then published an article in the Observer newspaper in London calling for action on what he called the forgotten prisoners all over the world. The achievements of this movement in the years that followed are far too many to be listed here. Thousands of prisoners of conscience have been released. Amnesty International forced the world to confront the horror of torture more than ever before, and argued successfully for an international prohibition of torture for the first time. It's our campaign against torture that won us the Nobel Peace Prize in 1976. And then there is the impact on international justice. By the way, I should say that I find it very easy to boast about Amnesty International's achievements because I haven't had much to do with it. I've of course been a supporter of Amnesty from outside, but I've been with Amnesty only for the last 1 year. And then there is the impact on international justice. Amnesty International played a crucial role in the creation of the International Criminal Court, which enables those responsible for serious war crimes and genocide to be brought to justice everywhere in the world. Only 20 years ago, it seemed obvious that murderous dictators like the Pinochets, Idi Amins, or Duvaliers of this world would never be brought to justice. It just didn't happen. Unseated leaders retired to their villas in their home country or abroad. These days they go to Saudi Arabia, by the way, and lived comfortably ever after. But things have significantly changed now. The ICC, which once seemed so unthinkable, has existed for almost a decade. Even the US, which once loathed it with a passion, and even passed a bill suggesting that Hague could be invaded if needed to punish those dangerous international judges, has now voted in favor of the referral of Libya to the ICC, thus giving its implicit blessing to the court. And this court is now truly global. Just last month, I met with the new Tunisian foreign minister in New York. He and his colleagues spoke warmly of the ICC. Tunisia's track record on accountability is still far from perfect, but the fact that Tunisia has signed up for the court and wants real justice, not just, I was going to say kangaroo courts, but I'm not sure if it's a very appropriate use of terminology in this country, is significant progress. If progress like that can be replicated elsewhere, it will have important implications. It's impossible to overstate the importance of achieving real accountability and real justice. This is a lesson which Sri Lanka, where tens of thousands of civilians died in the last stages of that country's long civil war in spring 2009, sadly has yet to learn. But we will continue to press for an international investigation into the crimes committed by both sides and thus to provide accountability. If that aim looks more achievable than it did just a year ago, I must say that's in large measure because of the work of Amnesty International and other human rights campaigners. On death penalty, which is another major area of work for Amnesty International, when we began our campaign against death penalty, the majority of the countries in the world were practicing death penalty, over 100 countries in the world. Today it's a dwindling minority. Benin in West Africa was the latest country to drop death penalty just last month. I think there's less than 30 countries now who continue to execute their own people, one of them being the United States. Amnesty International campaigned to stop the execution of Troy Davis in the US. Sadly, last month we and he lost that long battle. But his death cannot and will not be the end of the story. 600,000 people signed a petition protesting at his execution, a force of public opinion that will continue to have impact on the leaders of the United States. I'm convinced the inhumanity and the insanity of the death penalty cannot last forever. In fact, several states in the US have now stopped execution. Even in the seemingly incorrigible United States, change must come. Meanwhile, one of our current campaigns is focusing on ending the death penalty in Belarus. There will be a focus next week on 10th October on this, and I urge all of you to add your voices to that demand. That's the only country in Europe that's practicing death penalty. It might seem that nothing is going to change the minds of the Belarus government, but of course, we believe that things will change and they must change. Another important development is Amnesty's work, equally unthinkable just a few years ago, that on the achievable prospect of an arms trade treaty to be agreed next year at the United Nations. We still need to press hard to ensure that the right human rights language is included in that treaty, so that arms can no longer be sold to repressive regimes who then use these weapons to attack and kill their own citizens, as we continue to see in Bahrain, Yemen, Syria, and elsewhere. But we are making progress all the time. So much then for the idea of a lunacy. More has been achieved in the past 50 years than Peter Benenson could ever have dreamed of. I hope we can achieve equally remarkable things in the next 50 years. Everything that has happened in the Middle East is a reminder of why we can believe that the immovable may be movable after all. In Egypt, I was privileged just a couple of months ago to meet some of the country's brave human rights defenders. Those courageous men and women, in turn, insisted on the importance of human rights and Amnesty International's role. They were full of gratitude for the support from Amnesty over the years, by documenting violations, by supporting human rights defenders, and by creating much-needed pressure on the Mubarak regime. In fact, I always like to tell the story of a letter which we found in our archives recently, which Amnesty International wrote to Mubarak 1 week after he became the president, nearly 40 years ago. And in that letter, we had urged him not to follow the habits and practices of his predecessor. Unfortunately, he didn't read that letter, and he had to pay the price. It was intensely moving to hear their tributes to the organization's work. As so often in different protests and revolutions over the years, young people, and I'm very pleased to see many young people in this room today, played a central role in making change happen. The Polish writer Czesław Miłosz wrote many years ago, when Poland was still a communist one-party state, and I quote, "Our natural tendency to place the possible in the past leads us often to overlook the acts of our contemporaries, who defy the presumably unmovable order of things and accomplish what at first sight has seemed impossible or improbable." And as we now know, 2 years later, the Berlin Wall came down. Milosz's words about the achievability of change are as true today as when he wrote those words a quarter of a century ago. I believe he'll repeatedly be proved right in the future too about the possibilities of accomplishing what at first sight has seemed impossible or improbable. So let me try to look ahead. Despite what I said about the impossibility of making predictions, I'll take a stab at identifying 4 or 5 trends which will concern us in the coming years. The first one, of course, is the question of who will rule the world. Crucially, we must ask which governments will be the most powerful, whose voices will be heard most loudly. It's strange to remember that only a few years ago the word hyperpower was regularly used to describe the United States. We hear the word much less nowadays, but although we can hear them hyperventilating quite often. Economically and politically, the United States, though still powerful, make no mistake, is a shadow of its former self. And this trend looks likely to continue, and that has important implications for the work of all of us who are human rights activists. The role of other Western powers also seem less arrogant, if not less confident, than it was just a few years ago. The Goldman Sachs executive, who sadly we have had to rely on Goldman Sachs to do some of the thinking for us, came up with this acronym BRICS to refer to Brazil, Russia, India, China, and now South Africa. Can congratulate himself on his foresight. He created one of the most influential acronyms of recent times. The rising democracies, including Brazil, India, and South Africa, all have key roles to play, and that's not just in the political and economic sphere. That influence obviously central in the sphere of human rights. And when we talk about the BRICS countries, we should not forget the role of very many other important and growing countries, growingly powerful countries, Nigeria, Turkey, Mexico, and closer home, Indonesia. We are just about beginning to understand the extent to which geopolitical balances are shifting and will continue to shift. This has huge implications for Amnesty International as we seek to create global human rights change. Sadly, many of those countries, including my own, India, have a long way to go in terms of defending human rights on a global scale. I was telling Les and I think Monica yesterday that in my country, the indigenous population, we call them Adivasis, are supposedly 8% of the country's population. We actually don't really know the population because not many people who are doing the Indian census are actually allowed to go into the areas where they live. About 1/4 of the country is in a state of war against the state, and that 1/4 of the country essentially is where the indigenous population lives. There's an armed revolt against the state in these states and in these parts of the country, and it is oddly enough not much talked about in the international media, and it's a longer discussion to have with Les and our colleagues here as to what are the parallels of the indigenous movement in India and in fact in South Asia, I would say, compared to what you're going through here. It's very sad. We just had another demonstration just this week, in fact just 2 days ago, that not only did Russia and China both veto a relatively soft resolution on Syria at the Security Council in New York, but equally Brazil, India, and South Africa all abstained from that resolution. So clearly we have a long way to go before there's a better understanding of the importance of human rights in these countries for creating a safer world. China, of course, is in a league of its own in terms of becoming already the world's banker. And we all know that you don't really argue with your banker, especially if you have a large overdraft, as many countries have. Of course, in Australia, I've been told that since you've become a big quarry, they're also your biggest customer. On the political front, China remains a very repressive state where even to speak about crimes committed by the state can get you locked up. I had the privilege of representing Amnesty International on the invitation of Liu Xiaobo last year around the same time as he was given the Nobel Peace Prize. It was a powerful and moving occasion, and Liu's family invited us to attend because Liu is a prisoner of conscience of Amnesty International, and like Liu and many others, Amnesty has been fighting for the case of many of these political prisoners for decades now. As you know, Liu himself was not present for the ceremony. He was represented only by a powerfully symbolic empty chair while he was behind bars, given a long jail sentence for the crime of speaking truth to power. Even his wife was not allowed to travel for the ceremony, so that Liu himself went unrepresented by himself or his family, a precedent that we've not seen at the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony since the day of Hitler's Germany. China's violations are clear, but China also craves a certain respectability, which we need to leverage, even as we highlight the severe human rights violations within the country. In fact, many of the press people who were at the Peace Prize, the ceremony itself in Oslo, were asking me for my reaction on because China was really putting a lot of pressure on the ambassador's diplomatic presence in Oslo not to attend the Peace Prize ceremony. And my reaction was that actually it's a good sign. It means that they actually bothered about their international reputation. Even 10 years ago, if when the Dalai Lama was given the Peace Prize, I think, or at other moments, they've never bothered really about who gets the Peace Prize. So for the first time, we have a situation where they're actually getting more concerned about their reputation, and that can't be a bad thing. But also, other governments across the developing world will also have much greater impact from before, and we need to work together to make sure that these countries get more serious about their international obligations. Now, Amnesty International, ourselves, we are in the process of building amnesty in these countries. We're starting with Brazil and India this year and Sub-Saharan Africa next year. I am very excited about the possibilities of creating a strong membership base and building the human rights movement in these countries from a membership, an amnesty membership perspective, and there's some really exciting possibilities there. It's not going to happen overnight, it's a long haul, but absolutely important because these governments need to hear from their own people that they have to do the right thing on the global stage. So the first sort of trend or the first thing that I would say is very important as we look ahead in the 21st century from where we are today is the changes in the geopolitical shift of power. The second is the whole issue of women's rights. Now, I believe that belatedly, very belatedly, there's a growing international understanding of the importance of women's voices and participation in the political process. At the United Nations, where change often comes at a glacial pace, the creation of a single unified body, UN Women, has helped to make the issue more prominent. Amnesty International has, in fact, campaigned hard through the GEAR campaign for the formation of UN Women. Talking about the political participation of women, I was reminded, and I was telling my colleagues yesterday, the story which the Finnish president loves to tell. Halonen is one of the longest-serving women presidents in the world, one of the few long-serving women presidents in the world, and I think she's been the president of Finland for 8 years or 10 years, I don't remember exactly when, and she always tells us about the story when she went to a school outside Helsinki, which is the capital of Finland, and she was asking the kids there as to what are their aspirations when they grow up, what is it that they would like to become. And she was asking this of a little boy in the classroom, and he said he wants to become a doctor or engineer. And then she said, but wouldn't you like to become the president of this country? And apparently the boy said, in Finland, men can't become presidents. So that was a great story of how role modeling happens. But women and girls, as you know, suffer violence and discrimination in different contexts around the world, including, but not only in the Pacific region. And Patrick is here, who was a director in New Zealand. I've just come back from there. They released a report. In fact, Amnesty International released a report, which Patrick was leading in Auckland, I think, was it? Yeah, the report was released in Auckland at the Pacific Island Forum just last month, I think, showing, and the report was essentially about how Solomon Islands has denied or continues to deny the right to adequate housing, shelter, water, sanitation to its people. But it really focused on the impact that has had on the rights of women. And we surveyed as part of the report several women, and a shocking 2/3 of the girls and women we talked to for this report showed that they had been sexually and physically abused. And this is not an isolated case, as you know. More generally, the greater involvement of women in decision-making process is a trend which must be, and hopefully will be, accelerated. Egypt set a magnificent example with its protests in the early part of the year, where women played a leading role. Since then, however, we've seen a sidelining of women's role, and we're pushing hard to stop that process of marginalization. We have to confront this head-on and ensure that this damaging trend is reversed. Better understanding of the importance of women's human rights and their empowerment will make things better not just for women and girls, but for societies as a whole. And I don't really need to persuade this audience about it. From Amnesty's perspective, we will focus on improving sexual and reproductive rights. Our campaigning actions in our 50th anniversary year include a focus on the rights of women and girls in Nicaragua, with a strong push on the need to decriminalize abortion and thus save lives. Across the movement, more than 50,000 individually designed butterflies were created and sent to our partners in Nicaragua in a beautiful and unusual action. As one of our partners there declared, I quote, "Every Amnesty member that sends a card, that sends a butterfly, that sends a letter, is giving us strength to carry on fighting for the rights of girls and women. So please do send a butterfly to Nicaragua." The third trend, so I talked about the growing power of new developing emerging economies. I talked about the growing importance of women's rights and women's voices. And the third aspect which I want to touch on is the changing demographics. Now, at the end of this month, the population of the world officially crashes through the 7 billion mark. I understand that 31st of this month will officially now be called 7 billion day. Now, one of the important things here is that an increasing proportion of these 7 billion people will be living in cities. Those who live in cities are now already the majority of the world's population, and that will keep growing. The battle for land, particularly in cities, mainly for housing, is going to become much more serious. Amnesty International's campaign, which is called Demand Dignity in All, the overall campaign is called Demand Dignity. Within that, we have a strong focus on the issue of forced evictions, people being forced to and denied the right to adequate housing, is going to become more and more important. The second aspect, which is becoming very central, and I think actually Les touched on that, is the issue of the pressure on natural resources. And this is, of course, partly a demographic reality, but partly also a reality of the shifting forces of power. And here, corporate power has become central to the way in which natural resources are exploited in a way that is absolutely disrespectful of human rights and the environment. And we know that most of the times these natural resources are concentrated in places where Aboriginal communities and Indigenous communities live. So Amnesty's campaigns on corporate accountability and the whole push, the most recent one we did was, which we had a very important success, was with Shell in Nigeria. And we can talk about that later on for those of you who are interested. But the point I'm making really is that a growing urbanization, the pressure on land and cities, which is going to push people out of slums, and we are seeing this very much in Rio, for example, in Brazil now, as Rio gets prepared to host the World Cup. And I know when I say World Cup in this part of the world, I should clarify that this is the soccer World Cup. And of course, Rio is also going to be hosting the Olympics. So, and I'm talking about the Summer Olympics now. Both of these important events are going to be hosted there, and they're already starting to push people out from the city who are living in slums and favelas. So that's one dimension of the problem. And in rural areas, in mountainous regions, in many parts of the world where natural resources are stored, we're having the other dimension of the growing, changing demographic, where people are being pushed out. The right to water, the right to land is being violated in a systematic way. So that is the third trend I wanted to highlight. The fourth trend is the whole issue of the growing importance of technology and the sort of digitization of the world. Now, predicting technological change is as much of a mug's game as trying to predict what color, skirt length, or exotic vegetable may be fashionable in a few years' time. Past predictions on the future of technology have repeatedly, well, not quite hit the mark, shall we say. And I wanted to quote a few things just to prove my point. So first we have the chairman and founder of Digital Equipment Corporation arguing against the idea of the personal computer in 1977. And I quote, he says, "There's no reason anyone would want a computer in their home." And then we have the verdict of a Boeing engineer after the first flight of a twin-engine plane holding all of 10 people. And I quote, he says, "There will never be a bigger plane built." And finally, there was some of these people who are too visionary for their own good, like poor Lee DeForest, who in 1913 was prosecuted by the US government for selling stock fraudulently because he had made, within quotes, absurd and deliberately misleading statements on behalf of the radio telephone company. And his crime of absurdity was to claim that it would be possible in due course for people to talk to each other across the Atlantic. What a crazy idea. In short, we don't exactly know what comes next after Facebook, after Twitter, and after everything else that we've just begun to get familiar with. By the way, I always talk about Amnesty International as the first social network and the first Facebook, because the essential idea was the same: people getting together in small groups, talking to each other and working together on common purpose, common interests. And yet, one thing we do know, that the internet and everything associated with it will continue to impact our lives in ways that we can still barely get to grips with. Egypt and Tunisia and other revolutions, where the name of Facebook was painted on the walls, put paid to the idea that Facebook and Twitter were a political irrelevance. They may not have held the key to everything else, as some claimed, but they were certainly relevant. Now, the possibilities ahead of us are still enormous. Facebook and Twitter will come to seem the least of the changes as we move forward. Crowdsourcing can be highly relevant in documenting human rights violations and in bringing those violations to the attention of the world. Satellite imagery is another area that we've already worked with in Amnesty in Zimbabwe, in Saudi Arabia, and this will continue to develop in the years to come. The opportunities provided by social media, or some call them anti-social media, will continue to change by leaps and bounds as they have done in recent years. The use of social media, of course, and I always remind people, is not an alternative to the courageous work of people. For example, the people in Tahrir Square who put their bodies in front of the tanks. That was not a Twitter or a Facebook. That was human beings risking their life. But an important complementary process. Of course, the other thing we have to always remember, looking ahead, is that the possibilities of the internet are, of course, not just an opportunity, they're also a threat. A way that repressive regimes can fine-tune their big brother surveillance of their own citizens. And this is equally true of the Googles and Yahoos and Facebooks. Nonetheless, on balance, there seems to be little doubt that the possibilities of digital change will be for the good, not the bad. So just to recap, the kinds of things which I think will, without a doubt, shape the 21st century and the years ahead is the changes in the geopolitical power, the urbanization of poverty, the pressure on natural resources, the growing voice of women and young people, and all of the other points which are made. But of course, I think the most important point to remember as we look ahead is, it's not a question of, it's what is going to happen in the 21st century in relation to human rights, or even if we look ahead for the next 50 years, is not going to be determined by fate or some divine action alone. It's going to be determined by what we do. And here I want to talk about Australia a little bit, because if you think about it, if you make it much more concrete as to what is going to be the reality of human rights in Australia in the next decade or two, is going to be determined by each of you in this room, by the people of Australia and the Australian government. So what the future holds is also what is in your hands. So Australia, as you know, is a regional actor of great importance in the Pacific, in Asia. It can play an important role in the years to come. If it's not suspended between the old blocs and groupings, Australia can be, if it gets its own act together, become a voice that needs to be heard with the clarity that it deserves. Now, there are two very difficult issues that this country is currently grappling with, and I think it's important for us to reflect on this at this important conference. It was very important, I think, to hear from Les and Marushi, and there will be much more fruitful discussion, and yesterday the conference you already had on the subject of Aboriginal rights in this country. For me, this trip would not be complete without a visit to the Northern Territory, which I'm going to be doing, visiting the place which has the most improbable of names. It's called Utopia. An Amnesty International report published just 2 months ago shows how, starved of essential services, Aboriginal people living in traditional Indigenous communities in the Northern Territory will effectively be forced to abandon their lands, their homelands. In short, they are being illegally evicted. And statistics tell a clear story. With proper services like health, education, water, and shelter, people can be healthier and live longer in their own homelands. Uprooted from their lands, they will suffer. So making choices is an absolute right. The government has repeatedly failed to listen to those who are most affected by the decisions which it takes. And this, I'm referring to the Aboriginal people here. Australia is a signatory, and Les explained in some detail about the responsibilities that come with endorsing the declaration of the UN Indigenous Peoples' Rights. However, in practice, Australia is not keeping many of its commitments. It simply needs to do so, and I'm sure that this will come back in the discussions. The second issue, of course, is the moral and legal failure facing this country on the issue of asylum seekers and refugees. This is currently being used as an opportunistic political football, putting the lives of some of the most vulnerable people on the planet, including children, at risk. Seeking asylum when faced with a well-founded fear of persecution is not illegal. It is a right. Yet, if you were to believe the political debate in this country, you would be forgiven for thinking that the country was being illegally invaded by millions of people. It should never have been possible to contemplate sending asylum seekers to Malaysia, outsourcing obligations to a country which regularly canes, detains, and abuses asylum seekers. As one who has enjoyed visiting Australia over the years, I sometimes pinch myself and wonder, what would the region look like if Australia stepped up and showed real leadership on human rights? Sadly, this is not the case at this point. So I have to ask the question, what legacy is Australia passing on to future generations? I'll leave it at that. I'm sure it will come back in our discussions. Now, in relation to Amnesty International and the future, one thing I can say for certain, that Amnesty, both here in Australia and around the world, will remain as relevant in the 21st century as it has been in the past 50 years. Aung San Suu Kyi, heroine of Burma, offered a generous message to Amnesty International on the occasion recently of our Global Assembly meeting. She talked of a time 50 years from now when Amnesty International would no longer need to exist. That particular dream may not be easily achievable. Governments will always need to be held to account, after all. But Aung San Suu Kyi also had another aspiration in the video message that she delivered to us from her home, that the next meeting of our International Council or a future meeting could be held in a democratic and free Rangoon. Now, that would be an aspiration to strive for. And we all need to know, and we have to believe, as she does, as Mandela did, as Amnesty members always have, in the possibilities of change. The impact of an organization like Amnesty is only as good as its supporters and the members and the energy that you bring. We dream of what some perceive as unachievable goals, in the full knowledge that we can achieve more than they've ever dreamed of. I feel proud to lead an organization which achieves such extraordinary change and extraordinary things. So thank you all in conclusion for your engagement, your commitment. We may not know exactly what is around the corner, but we do know that we will continue to create human rights change and impact. I trust you'll enjoy this conference. There's some amazing speakers lined up, and there's, I'm sure, even more amazing people here in the audience. There will be a great deal of stimulation and debate. And as I said at the Sydney Opera House, as we celebrate the revolutions in the Middle East and North Africa, we might have to think hard as to whether this country also needs a human rights revolution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that talk, Salil. Lots of food for thought there. And this is the part of this session where the floor is open to you to ask questions. So we're going to have a discussion for about half an hour on the issues that Salil raised and any other issues that you might think are pertinent. There'll be two people wandering around with microphones, so if you could just please put your hand up, and when you speak, if you could give your name, and perhaps if you're representing an organisation, give the name of that organisation, and please try and keep the questions short and sharp. I might start off the discussions, Salil, by asking you just to pick up on the last point that you made about what we do here in this country. In your talk at the Opera House at the Festival of Dangerous Ideas, you talked about the loss of moral authority by Western governments and Western leaders. Our leaders here are constantly talking about the importance of the national interest. They're putting the national interest first. And every poll tells us that the main concern of Australian citizens is the economy. So anything that's done to shore up our economy and in the national interest, therefore securing our borders and other, so all issues are decided on the basis of our national interest. What hope is there then for governments taking the right having the right attitude and taking the right steps on human rights issues like asylum seekers and like Indigenous issues, which clearly they're all at sea about, and I think they don't see that as a vote winner.
Thank you, Mayor. By the way, I don't pretend to have answers to all the questions which are being asked here. I have some of my colleagues here sitting quietly in the back row with me and Steve. If the questions get really difficult, I pass it on to them. No, but I think on this, the first point you're raising, I wouldn't want to draw parallels between Australia and Tunisia or Egypt, but I must say that those of you who've heard President Ben Ali in Tunisia speaking, or indeed President Mubarak speaking, they've always talked about national interest and public order and stability. So that is the line which was given. In fact, Tunisia in North Africa was the country which had the best economic growth rate. It had the most amount of stability and public order. Western tourists were constantly going, certainly in Europe, it was a favorite destination to go to the beautiful beaches of Tunisia, and people would go to the beaches and leave, and so this idea that, you can have, that you have to trade off between economic development, public order, stability on the one hand, and human rights on the other, is something which we squarely reject. In fact, it's quite the opposite. If you have respect for human rights, if you promote human rights, that is the only way you're going to get sustained economic development, public order, and stability. And we know of, there's so many other examples across the world where the country which is more respecting of its people, because this is the other thing which is very bizarre. When people talk about economic growth and public order, at the same time, we start wondering which public are they talking about. I mean, in this country, if you have 500,000 Aboriginal people, and you say that what's important is that the people's progress is central, but the rights of 500,000 people are ignored, it just doesn't add up. I mean, it's one thing to talk about refugees or asylum seekers because they're coming from outside, but when you have your own people's rights being violated. I think, you can see there's a certain pattern. It's the same people who use the same arguments, and I think we have to deal with it very squarely. And we had the same conversation in New Zealand in the last 2 days with the government there, who are pushing the idea of economic opportunity and growth in the Pacific. And I always, draw the parallel with this Tunisian vegetable vendor, Mohamed Bouzizi, who set himself on fire. And when he did so, did he set himself on fire because he was unemployed, he was not able to get a license to do his vegetable vending, or did he set himself on fire because he didn't have a voice and the right to participate? And actually it was both. So the idea that you can have economic growth and you don't need to have other freedoms is just fundamentally untrue.
Thank you. Now, anyone like, yes, the lady just here. Now the microphone's making its way to you. If you could tell us your name first.
Marie Clem, and I'm a local Amnesty member. I'm wondering, with the convergence of technologies and also holding governments to account, what Amnesty International might be able to do in conjunction with kindred bodies in perhaps taking over that whistleblower role where WikiLeaks might just have to leave off.
We had, by the way, Julian Assange was one of the speakers at the same event where I spoke at the Opera House, and he made a very interesting set of observations. Now, overall post 9/11, the balance between disclosure of information and information should be available to the public which affect public interest, and the state's interest in keeping things secret and transparent has been heavily skewed in favor of state secrecy and this public order, security kind of question. So overall, my view is that the work that many organizations and human rights defenders across the world have done to really make freedom of information much more real and meaningful has been a very signal contribution, and I would add that WikiLeaks has certainly contributed to that process. The difficulty that we've had with WikiLeaks very specifically has been in relation to the protection of the identity of the sources of those who have given the information. And that has been very problematic, and we've had these discussions with WikiLeaks more than once in the last few months. But I think, certainly Amnesty International's work is centrally linked to freedom of expression and freedom of information. Most recently, we've been working on the case of freedom of information in Nigeria, for example, where as I was saying earlier, that we have a situation there, and in fact, it's interesting, both in Nigeria and India, we use provisions related to right to information to prize open the facts which are not being disclosed by corporations. So in the case of India, one which I'm much more familiar with, the company is called Vedanta, which is a UK-based bauxite mining company, and which was actually working in the area of the Dongria Kond in eastern India, which is a traditional land of the Aboriginal indigenous communities there. And they were displacing very large numbers of indigenous people from their land, their livelihood, and also from their where their temples and their deities and their spirits were located. Now, what we did in this case was to work with the indigenous communities and the local civil society, civil rights activists to use the right of India has got actually a very progressive Right to Information Act, and we use the Right to Information Act to make information available in the public domain and really challenge Vedanta. We also, at the same time, used the fact that they were a listed public company in the UK through our members and shareholders to put pressure on the investors. But that combination worked incredibly well, and the government of India was forced then to stop the expansion of the bauxite mining company. So I'm just giving you one example where, because the issue of WikiLeaks is fundamentally related to the freedom of information, and I think that is absolutely central. Whistleblowing is one part of it, but I think it's an overall push towards freedom of expression, freedom of information.
Maybe one down the front here.
Thank you. I'm John Anderson. I've been a member for quite a while. The thing I wanted to raise particularly, I think, is the issue about refugees, because I don't agree with the Australian government's standard and procedure at all. But the point is that the convention really is something which is nicely designed for relatively small numbers of people coming across, and it was sort of done at the end of the Second World War and so on. My concern is that as the climate changes, perhaps, we have earthquakes, we have all sorts of disasters, large numbers of people might try to leave one country to go into a neighbouring country. And it seems to me that we really need to have a look at bring up some other kind of standards for large quantities of people, not just on political basis, but on the basis of humanitarian issues as well.
Sure, I mean, there's a lot of debate right now about climate refugees and what is going to happen. And one of the sort of big streams of work that Amnesty is working on is what is called people on the move and the human rights impact on people on the move. But I must say that, the scale is a real question in the case of Australia. As you know, last year I think there were not more than 8,000 or so people who were actually seeking asylum in this country. If you compare that with France and Germany, which were 30,000, 40,000, Sweden. I think overall, if you look at the proportion of refugees coming to Western countries or seeking asylum seekers into Western countries, Australia is less than 2% or so. Of course, these facts are somehow shrouded, but the bigger point you're making about how do we look forward and think about these issues, if you look at what happened in Libya, for example, the numbers there are in a totally different order of magnitude. So over 1 million, I think, almost 1 million people have come out of Libya following the fighting or during the conflict. And again, the paradox is very clear that 500,000 of those have been taken by Egypt, 300,000 or so have been taken by Tunisia, and a few thousand tried to cross the Mediterranean and go to Europe. And the European countries, you may be aware of this location called Lampedusa in Italy, where Amnesty is really looking at all of the violations from the European countries are not keeping their commitments of both European refugee conventions and the international obligations they have. But they're calling it a massive influx of people. So, I mean, it's totally out of sync. Some of the poorest countries, I mean, if you compare Australia or Italy or France economically with these countries, which are Tunisia and Egypt, which are themselves going through such a huge transition. But they have, in fact, in the case of Tunisia, a lot of the refugees have been taken to people's homes. It's not even camps and, the formal UNHCR type model. People have just taken these people into their homes saying, you are fighting for your freedom. We've just gone through a similar experience. We are suffering. We don't have food to eat, but please come and stay in our houses. It's a bit like what Marushi said about the Aboriginal people of Victoria, I think, welcoming her with open arms when they themselves are going through such difficulty. But I think the point you're making is valid, and I think we can have more discussions as to how do we look further forward if the numbers are going to increase due to natural factors as to whether the current conventions we have are fit for purpose.
The gentleman in the blue shirt at the back.
Hi, my name's Tarek. I'm from Deakin University in Melbourne. You spoke about the Arab Spring and all the countries that have gone through their revolutions. Occupy Wall Street, which is in its third week at the moment, and I heard reports that there's about 5,000 people there just today. What do you think is the significance of that from a global context?
Okay. This is the nice thing about Amnesty International. You can be asked about anything under the sun. Occupied Wall Street. I must say I was really tempted. I was hoping I could have been there myself. I spent my last 6 years at the UN in New York before I joined Amnesty International, and I was wishing this had happened when I was there. So at a personal level, a lot of outrage, and in the way in which the bankers and many of these large economic actors have gone unaccountable, have been unaccountable, while countries have been collapsing one after the other. Iceland, Greece, and Portugal, and so that's absolutely the case. Now, as far as Amnesty International is concerned, one of the criticisms we get all the time is, why are you constantly increasing your spread and covering more and more issues? So I think occupying Wall Street, I'd keep that out of our brief for now.
Perhaps someone on this side now, right up the back. Oh, George.
Thanks, Mary. Yes, George Williams from the University of New South Wales. My question relates to the future of human rights themselves, and indeed what's striking about the sort of language we're using today, freedom of information, refugees' rights, self-determination, Indigenous rights, is they didn't exist a century ago. And I'm wondering, if you look forward to the next century, do you see the need for the creation of new human rights that don't exist at the moment? Are there gaps that need to be filled, or do you think that the toolbox is essentially large enough for the sort of problems that Amnesty is dealing with, and that we don't need to move substantially beyond the set of human rights that we have today?
No, I think one of the, on the technical front, in terms of the legal suite of things we have, Whitney might want to add more from a legal perspective, but certainly I think I would expect that the principles and the values which underlie the human rights approach, that is fundamentally the same. In fact, and it's very important that we're using the same yardsticks internationally. I think that's the beauty of having an international human rights framework. But in terms of the specifics, I think the point that our friend made earlier about whether we need to think hard on if there's a significant scaling up of climate refugees as to whether the existing human rights laws and frameworks are fit for purpose, I think it's a very valid question to ask. One of the areas where this is already being tested, and it's something which we have covered in the foreword to our annual report in 2011. The annual report is Amnesty's flagship publication, which sort of gives it's a kind of a state of the world report from our lens on human rights. And one of the issues we've talked about there is on the issue of the growth of the internet and social media, and as to whether this requires some fresh thinking on how we need to adapt and fine-tune and expand the current human rights laws and frameworks. But I'm sure one of the important reasons why Amnesty, I think, has been successful also is that over the 50-year period, much as we've been criticized, I was joking a little bit on the Occupy Wall Street thing, but it's also true that I think one of the reasons Amnesty has remained relevant and effective 50 years later, not to suggest that there are no areas where we need to improve. There are many, many gaps which we need to improve in terms of our own effectiveness. But by and large, Amnesty has grown and remains strong and credible and respected across the world because we've been learning and adapting at each stage and looking at our mandate, looking at our scope of work. When we started, we were focused very much on prisoners of conscience. Of course, we realized then that a lot of the prisoners are being tortured, which took us into the whole area of torture. Many of them were being executed, which took us into the area of death penalty. Of course, the governments became smarter. They started disappearing people, not putting them in prisons. So we started working on enforced disappearances, looking more upstream at dictatorships, authoritarian rulers, how to make them accountable. And then the other dimension was which we talked about in my presentation was many of the people in prison were men, not women. So the issue of women's rights had been somewhat neglected. So we had to look at that. And as the developing countries became more important and our membership in these countries started growing, the issue of economic, social, cultural rights became much more important. And so we've been constantly rebalancing and adapting. So I would see that as part of the answer to what you're saying, because if I'm not mistaken, and here, Whitney, feel free to add, is that some of the points, some of the things which we challenged, for example, on torture and death penalty, etc., were actually outside the legal framework at the time. So we were pushing the boundaries. We went far beyond what was at that point acceptable, even from a human rights law perspective. And I think right now, I think on the harm principle is one of the areas which Whitney's been raising, is as to whether we should actually really push the boundaries in that one. Whitney, you want to add something on this?
area that I think we need to start looking at, and we actually have a book coming out on this, but we've always seen rights as something that we hold in today, and we actually haven't talked about the rights of future generations, and I think we're at a point where we absolutely have to do that.
And I guess one of those rights would be the environment and ensuring we hand on a sustainable environment. Another question on this side, the young lady up the back. Someone got a microphone? Great.
Hi, Salil. It's Prabha Nandagopa from the Australian Human Rights Commission. It's now been 6 months since the UN expert panel released its report into Sri Lanka, finding credible allegations of war crimes committed by both sides during the end of the civil war. I have firstly 2 questions. Number 1, what do you think it's going to take for Tamil civilian victims to receive justice and compensation outside of some domestic monitoring mechanism, which, as we know, has failed? And secondly, what role should the Australian government, as a leader in the region, be taking?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned it. I did touch on it briefly in my presentation. We raised this in the last 2 days with the New Zealand government, and we are definitely going to raise it with Kevin Rudd when we meet him later this month. I think both both New Zealand and Australia have been quite vocal in the past on the Sri Lanka question, and we are very appreciative of that as a government. As you said, the LLC, the internal process really was, from our perspective, not very helpful, and the UN panel has been very clear. It's confirmed what a lot of Amnesty reports and Amnesty statements have been saying now for months and years, that the violations are at a scale and a gravity which are just unbelievable. So the question, as you say, is how do we make change happen? I think we make change happen in Sri Lanka just like we made it happen in many other places. It's very difficult, I think, for the Tamils or right-think people inside Sri Lanka to do more than what they've done, because the government has created a real atmosphere of fear and intimidation. And it's not, the case of Sri Lankan government, the threats are not empty threats. They follow it up with real action. People have been locked up, tortured, disappeared, and this is happening with journalists, with students. We've documented many of these cases already. So what needs to happen is international pressure, which is why we've called for an independent international investigation. And as you know, we've met with the Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon. He's referred it now to the Human Rights Council, and the time is now for all of the governments in the region to go public in calling for an independent international investigation. That's what we've said to the New Zealand government yesterday when we met the Associate Foreign Minister. We'll do the same here. I also personally raised it with the Brazilian Foreign Minister, because this takes us back to the growing importance of the BRIC countries, and there's a sense of solidarity here, kind of a north-south divisions. All the developing country governments, for all the wrong reasons, they support some of these regimes who are known violators of human rights. So I think the time has come for us as members, activists, to put pressure from our side, but also for governments who claim to be human rights champions to take action. I know the CHOGM meeting happening in Perth is an important opportunity. There are some divisions, as you know, between the governments, the developed country governments, on this issue. It's not just China, but the US has been sitting on the fence quite a lot. We've also been talking to them. So, we are putting pressure through lobbying, through campaigning efforts from our side. Steve, who's here also in the back row, has been personally a big champion, a fighter on fighting for these issues. He's been quite heavily involved with the Channel 4 documentary, which some of you may have seen. We've contributed a great deal in making that happen. So we are pushing on all fronts, and I think that's the way we normally do it. And yes, at this point it might look very difficult, but that's how it always looks, and then things change.
Let's see how we're going in time. I think we have time for one more question. I think it's the side of this room. So this gentleman here.
Hello, I'm Ben Abram from the University of Otago in New Zealand. My question follows on very nicely from the previous question, in terms of that it's a massive global trend now that conflicts and wars are overwhelmingly civil conflicts and inter-country conflicts rather than between states. And so this obviously leaves massive intergroup tension and very divided communities and a lot of animosity between groups and communities. There needs to be large-scale reconciliation and healing between these groups. And my question is, do you think that there's any trouble or limitations in promoting human rights, which are, in essence, very individualistic in these situations? And if not, what role do you think human rights can play as a concept, and what should their priority be in overcoming big group animosity and divided communities?
Well, I think this is a big. I mean, each of these questions you guys are asking needs a day or two of a conference or a seminar in itself. So I'm trying to give you answers, and I know also that there are many people in this room who know much more than me on these. Certainly the academic debate on individual versus group rights, etc. It's a raging discussion which is never going to be resolved in that sense. By the way, you are the one who I met in Christchurch Airport. That's right. So this guy comes up to me in Christchurch Airport and says, "Do you work for Amnesty International?" And I travel so much, so if I'm in the airport in Mogadishu, my answer is to say no, I'm not. So I'm kidding. But it did. I thought, should I sort of declare who I am or not? And he said, "Are you going to the Brisbane conference?" I said, "Okay, that's a good guy now." No, but I think, on the question of, because you made several points there, but I think on the question of how do we get the sort of result we're looking for in divided societies where there is civil conflict, etc. I think yes, healing and reconciliation, etc. is absolutely important, but our point always has been that cannot be at the cost of justice and accountability. Of course, so you say, how do you create the right sort of outcome? The right outcome comes through ensuring accountability, justice, and reparations. You cannot find a healing without I was in Suez this time in Egypt when I was there a couple of months ago, and I met the mothers of the first two people who gave their lives, the martyrs. I met the mothers of the first two martyrs, because the most brutal attacks happened in Suez, where the police and the military forces, the security forces of Mubarak took action against the protesters, most brutally in Suez. And the mothers of these two young men, yes, you can talk about reconciliation, and we should, but in the first instance, what they're looking for is justice and accountability. So you cannot ask people to reconcile at the cost of justice and accountability. And how do you? That's why I said it's a very complex question. As each context is different. Each society is different, and solutions can't be uniform. And I was asked this morning in my ABC interview about Somalia, as to and we've done a report, for example, on the plight of the children in Somalia who've been forgotten in the midst of this conflict. And as you know, Somalia is a highly divided society at this point in time. But there's no shortcuts, I don't think, and I don't believe that you have some solutions which are outside human rights. I think if you have a very systematic, integrated approach, which is human rights based, that's the way you're going to find the solutions which are durable and sustainable. Because otherwise you can get some shortcuts, but I don't think, that'll be like, what do you call those things, first aid, kind of band-aid type solutions. So sustainable, comprehensive solutions require a human rights approach.
Thank you for raising all those issues, and thank you for ending on this note of peace with justice, because often people will point out that justice is in the eye of the beholder, but and to a certain degree, of course, that's true, but you can't even hedge towards justice if one group doesn't have a voice. So I think an integral part of it is giving both parties in the conflict a real voice at the negotiating table. Thank you very, very much for your questions. There'll be more opportunities to ask questions through the day, and I'd like to say thank you very much to the Secretary-General as well. And it's been such a joy to meet you and to listen to you. We'll have more opportunities to hear you through the day. It's also particularly a joy to learn a little bit about the person in this very important role, the person behind this amazing organisation. Thank you, Salil.